Good afternoon, good day, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining from, and welcome to the Transformation Catalyst webinar series brought to you by Gagen MacDonald and INNOVISOR. Today is the second webinar in the series, and your presenters are Rob Wodzinski, Senior Director from Gagen MacDonald, and Sanna Crawford, the Client Enabler at INNOVISOR. Today's webinar is scheduled to run for 1 hour. We will be fielding questions, so please use the Q&A box that you see in the bottom right of your screen. We may not get to all your questions during the session, but we will make every effort to respond after the session. Additionally, we have some great resources for you, which you can find at the bottom right of your screen. It's a paperclip icon called Related Content. Finally, today's session is being recorded, and we will share a link with you afterwards so you can watch it again. So without further ado, please welcome Sanna and Rob. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for everyone who's joining. I'm Sanna Crawford, and I'm a client enabler with INNOVISOR. And INNOVISOR is a Copenhagen-based boutique consultancy that specializes in organizational network analysis. So we support client organizations of all sizes and shapes and industries to leverage their informal network and realize that people are their greatest asset in change.
Thanks, Sanna. And I'm Rob Wodzinski, the Senior Director here at Gagen MacDonald and the team lead for our Experience Studio. At Gagen, we spent 25 years pioneering, working with many of the world's most complex and admired companies to bring humanity to strategy execution, forging cross-disciplinary approach to both change and transformation as leaders in organizational communication, culture, leadership, and employee engagement. And as you saw on our title slide and what we're covering today, we've got some interesting topics to walk through: making the invisible visible, infusing interactions with purpose, and building belonging and providing meaningful support. Without further ado, we will get started here on our content with this image that we love, that we use as the perception of remote work when the pandemic started. We were in a time of what seemed like permanent flexibility. We had new pets, our own space on our own time, and new ways to connect and collaborate with everyone. But as time has gone on and businesses have changed, we've seen a struggle emerge, right? What was once acceptable or critical to our health and safety is now a battlefield of wills. So we have leadership executives driving for return to office and to measure things in the office, and employees who want to continue with their new world of freedom, right? And so that's some of what we're going to address as we continue to talk about some of these key topics. But really, that remote, hybrid versus return to office is not the only thing that we know you're struggling with today. We know that there's quiet quitting, disengagement, and people kind of checking out of work, just doing what they need to get by. There's transformation and change overload, initiatives running constantly and in parallel, demanding emotional time from all of our employees.
There's also the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging agenda that kind of needs to underpin all of the decisions that we make in the organization. There's also the issue of loneliness and disconnection, which we're going to go into a bit later on as well. But basically, there are a whole lot of things going on top of figuring out the hybrid workplace.
Thanks, Sunny. And so we have this tension, right? The agenda of the organization, the agenda of our employees. Leaders are facing a growing, increasingly tension-filled dynamic within the organization as they need to measure engagement and, as a result of that, productivity, right? But the agenda of the employee is different. The measure is still in discussion, right? But when we don't address it, we see things like quiet quitting pop up as trends in the news. The desired outcome, I think we would all agree for our employees and as employees, is professional fulfillment, right? And so when you think about this dichotomy, it's interesting to think about what the two wills are battling out. But we've seen that most recently in the Microsoft Work Trends Index that was released, 84% of people would be motivated to come into work more frequently by the promise of being able to enhance connections with coworkers, right? Bosses are trying to use policies to force them back rather than leveraging human connection and collaboration. Some of what we'll talk about today as we keep moving here. So it's an employee-first era, right? Great resignation, leadership empathy, unprecedented times. We're all familiar with these terms. They're cliches that we've heard at various times, are dominating the dialogue around all of our organizations and our people. But it's an easy trap to fall into, right? We're dealing with aftershocks of the greatest globally experienced event since World War II. Lives and societies have fundamentally changed. So it's no surprise that our basic relationships have come under intense scrutiny and reevaluation. It's naive for us to think our relationships with our jobs, our careers, our organizations, and the people we work for and work with would either remain unscathed or worse, revert back to what we remember from 5 years ago. I'm sure you've all done reevaluation in the last 24 to 36 months around how you work. And from the data you've gathered, working remote, continuous end-to-end scheduling, health and safety protocols, we can ask a couple of questions to see what you've uncovered. Did you gain deeper and more thorough understanding of the human experience factors that impact your people and your organization? Have you identified and genuinely learned who the people are in your organization that truly influence the movement of your culture? From our experience, we believe human experience, data, and insights from these questions are critical to you, your people, and their desire for professional fulfillment and for your organization. When we think about how we work today, right? How do we actually work? The jury is out on whether digital and a fully immersed hybrid experience could deliver the connection that employees desire, right? We don't know the answer to this, and we're all learning as we go. But in lieu of having a completely new solution, right, we do have some ideas and solutions for you that we'd like to discuss. But before we get into today's session and these big ideas that we're starting to talk about, we'd love to do a quick poll, and it's anonymous. We understand people are at different points in their day, but we just want to ask a simple question to get us started as we go here. What is your current level of connection to your work? We'll give everyone a few seconds to make a selection. Hopefully everybody has seen the poll pop up.
In the meantime, what about you, Rob? What would you answer to this question?
If I were to pick one of these, I would probably go with a roller coaster. I think we're working on figuring things out as we go. We are using more intentional office time, but also still working fully hybrid or fully remote and virtual. So I feel like it's constantly changing from one day to the next, depending on how much time I have to connect with people on my team and in the organization. How about yourself, Sunny?
Yeah, good question. I think I would choose the more good days than bad, because I think we were lucky in creating some good structures from the very beginning with my team. We have a team checking every morning, even if we're working from home. And I think those things really help. And we also prioritize social time together, and I think that also helps a lot. But yeah, I can also relate to the roller coaster thing. Yeah. Let's see, we have a few answers by now. We'll leave a bit more time, I think.
Yeah, it looks like we've got about half of the viewers have submitted responses. A few more seconds and then we'll move on. We are very curious to see what people say. 37. Looks like we might be plateauing. 38. Okay. All right. Should we keep going? Let's keep going.
Sure.
So let's take a look. Based on, looks like just over half of folks responded. Looks like we've got a nice tie between living the dream. I'm sorry, it's a roller coaster, and people feeling lucky that there are more good days than bad. Some people are living the dream, and it looks like we do have a percentage of people having more bad days than good. So I think it's a mix, and I think that's interesting data for us to focus on and think through as we continue the conversation. Anything that surprised you there, Sunny?
No, I mean, I think I'm happy to see that there are so few that answers that they have more bad days than good. But I'm not so surprised to see that there's a distribution between the rest. So. That's cool.
So given that, right, what can we all agree on? You know, our objective and goals for our culture are still the same. We want it to be healthy, vibrant, We want the organization and employee agendas to line up and match. And there's work to be done to that end, right? But we can all agree on sort of the end cause of our cultures being very productive and supportive of our employees and their needs.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, yeah, just even though we all do have, as you say, different contexts, different preferences, different preconditions, we can agree that we want some sort of togetherness with our team and feel that we have that connection with our workplace, right? And so I think that's also the one big question, or one of the big questions on all business leaders' mind right now is, can we create that culture of connection and purpose in the hybrid world, right? And we, of course, claim that yes, we can. And so we would like to tell you a little bit now about the secret to fueling such connectivity, because it's not easy. And there's really only one way to actually get it right, and that starts by mapping your connectivity. So as with any change, you have to first kind of unveil your current situation, create a baseline that is actually based on data, and use that to develop an understanding of what you're dealing with. And to do that, you need to map your informal networks. Now, this is what's traditionally visible, right? This is what we know about the connections in our organization. Our org chart tells us what the reporting lines are, what teams we belong to, the division of labor, basically. So it might be more or less complicated than the one that we see here, but what it does tell us is how we're formally organized and connected. So we can see there are some square shapes there at the top that represent managers. We have some circles representing employees below, and they're all organized by colors that represent reporting lines of teams. But what then about the human interactions? Because we all know, of course, we can just go to ourselves, that in every organization there are informal interactions that happen that are not based on the org chart, but on a million other different things, right? So people build different relationships or different types of relationships. They build different strengths of relationships, and they're based on different contexts and purposes. So there are some people in our workplace that we would go to when we need to ask for help or advice on a project. Some people we go to have quicker decision-making processes. There will be other people perhaps that we go to when we just need to have a break and have a little laugh with someone. And probably yet other people that would go for inspiration or feedback on a new idea or advice on career development. So basically, in reality, the organization looks more like this, like a network, right? So suddenly, yeah, you can say that the reality becomes visible. Here, for example, we can see that CEO, that black square that was on top before, is suddenly now actually sitting in the periphery of a network here. They're only connected to one other manager, that blue one there, who then connects that top person to the rest of the network. We can see that there's actually one person, a blue dot up to the left, who's completely disconnected from the networks. We can see a yellow square manager in the middle, who's the one holding everything together, basically. And so these informal networks, they look different in all organizations, but they exist in all organizations. And they matter for the way that we lead change and build culture. And so I'm not going to get too technical today about the methodology behind organizational network analysis and how exactly to go about mapping these informal network. But I do want to emphasize the importance of a people-first approach when you do this. And so that's also, of course, what we at INNOVISOR and Gagen MacDonald are all about. We need to ask the people. So when we talk about organizational networks here, that means that we've gone in and asked people, who do you connect to and how? What's the context and the value of that relationship? So we really need people's input to get an accurate idea of this, right? Because it's only when we understand our people that we can start understanding how to activate and leverage these networks.
Yeah, and what's so amazing about this model and what Sunny's talking about is that we're mapping energy within our organization, right? And these are the unseen kind of energy channels where things are getting done actions are happening, the culture is moving forward or changing in different ways. And that's super exciting. And that's a lot of what we talk about in our work is how do you activate and harness that energy, be it good, positive energy for an initiative, or even if it's a negative energy, how do we repurpose that and use it constructively to move things forward? So something to think about as we continue to move through the presentation, but I just think it's a fascinating connection to make.
Exactly. Thanks, Rob. Okay, so now we've told you it all starts with mapping connectivity, but once we've made those informal networks visible, what can we then use that information for? So network analysis can be used for a lot of different purposes, as long as you make sure to tailor the design and the analysis to the purpose that you want to achieve. So as our colleague Hannah mentioned in the beginning, I think, of this webinar, is that this is the second out of 3 webinars in a series. And so in the first one, that was a couple of weeks ago, our colleagues were talking about how to leverage the informal networks to succeed with any type of change or transformation, be it structural, cultural, or whatever. In the third webinar that comes a couple of weeks after this one, two other of our colleagues are going to talk about networks in the context of post-merger integration. But as you know, today we will talk about fueling the right collaboration and connectivity in the hybrid workplace. And so we're going to focus specifically on 4, or you could say 3+1 fundamental aspects of connectivity. So first, we're going to talk about purposeful interactions. How do people actually get work done in the hybrid workplace? How can we be more intentional about the way we collaborate? Secondly, we'll talk about building belonging. How can we build connectivity to ensure workplace inclusion and well-being and combat that loneliness that we see is increasing? Thirdly, we'll talk about evolving the employee experience. So how can we create the best workplace experience for an organization full of diverse individuals? And then the fourth aspect is sort of underpinning and integrated into all of the other 3 ones, and it's about leadership alignment. So how do we align and equip leadership team to facilitate this well-connected organization that we want to see? And also, how do we make sure that the leadership team itself is coherent and well-connected? Did you want to add anything there, Rob?
No, I think that's perfect. Yeah.
Good. Then we'll dive right in and talk about, first of all, purposeful interactions and also how to engineer the right collaboration between the right people. And I think we have another poll for you all before we dive into some more information. So we would like to hear from you. How much do you successfully collaborate at work? So the poll should be showing up now, and you have a few different options.
Sunny, did you want to take a pass at answering this one?
Yeah, I might. It's a difficult one because I think it varies. It's like that roller coaster again, I think. In some projects, and I think I often feel it afterwards if I've been in a meeting or a project where I felt like, actually, that was a bit too much collaboration. I didn't need to be in all of those meetings. Whereas in others, it's the other way around. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah, it's that question of how am I being intentional with my time? Am I in meetings just to be in meetings because we need to check in and talk about stuff? Are we actually collaborating and solving a problem together? It's much more of a combo, I feel like, on some days than others. And then other days, it's fully immersed in collaboration all day long, solving problems, which is feeling more productive, right? So it's a mix, which obviously changes as you go between hybrid and in-person.
Indeed. Let's see. We do have quite a few responses. Maybe I'll wait for a couple more.
Looks like just over half again.
Yeah. Okay, let's move forward. Some results here, yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And that's also what we talked about, the combo. It's actually the one with half of the responses here. Yeah. But a little bit spread out. And I think that also makes a lot of sense because, again, all organizations and teams and cultures and individuals are different. So it's we don't all fall into the same category. So let's talk a bit about purposeful interactions and collaboration. What does it mean to have an agile organization? Because there's a lot of talk about agility, and it's been a buzzword for the last couple of years, but what does that actually mean? And so in the context of work networks and collaboration, we talk about agility as a well-connected network where people collaborate efficiently and effectively, both within their own teams, but also across teams in a way that makes sense. So that basically means that the different parts of an organization, whether it's different locations or functions or hierarchies, collaboration happens across, so that knowledge and innovation and all these things flow seamlessly and doesn't stay isolated in certain corners and pockets of an organization. But at the same time, there's not too much unnecessary collaboration taking place, because if we use up too much bandwidth on collaboration that has no value, then we also lose out, basically. So agility happens in that sweet spot in the middle, basically. So the right collaboration, the right amount and type of collaboration between the right people. So how do we get to that point is the question. So we'll go through three steps here, basically. Identifying the risks in your networks, strengthening the resilience and agility of your networks, and most importantly, I think, define the purpose of the connectivity. So mapping informal networks gives us a lot of information that helps us identify risks and then target interventions to where they have the biggest impact. So firstly, networks tell us how connected or fragmented our organization is, how agile it is. So how does knowledge, ideas, perceptions flow in the network, with what speed? Where does collaboration, decision-making, and innovation happen? Are different parts of the organization connected and pulled together as one, or are they completely siloed? And where exactly are the gaps and the untapped potential? Secondly, the networks tells us what the biggest drivers or blockers of connectivity are. So from experience, we know that the most common barriers are location, department, hierarchy, tenure as well, because often when you start in the company at the same time as someone, you tend to actually get to know them a bit better and stick with them for the rest of your time in the organization. And gender as well is a big factor. So these factors always play a role in the way that people interact with each other and who we tend to reach out to. But some factors are stronger than others in specific organizations. So it always varies from case to case, right? And there might be, of course, other factors than the ones I mentioned now as well. So you really do need the data to fuel your actions instead of guessing where to focus, basically. And the third thing that I want to mention that the networks tell us about is the certain key individuals in different networks, or certain key positions that people occupy in the networks. For example, who are the most trusted people, those with some extra social capital that kind of has that informal influence on the engagement and the perception of their colleagues, who are the top collaborators, or for example, as we can see in the visual here, who are the brokers who hold different parts of the organization together, or as we like to put it, how many people could be run over by a bus before the network falls apart. And we don't want that to be too few, because basically, as you can see in the picture here, those three people with circles around them, if they were to not necessarily be run over by a bus then, but if they were to leave for any reason, be it moving into a new job, parental leave, sickness, what have you, then the knowledge flows between the kind of distinct clusters that we see here, that would just completely stop and fall apart, right? So that definitely represents a risk. And for these people who occupy these positions in the network, the risk is amplified by the fact that they are often overwhelmed because they have this busy position in the network, kind of a bottleneck position, and often under-recognized because this is invisible before you map it, right? So that just piles onto that risk of them leaving as well. So those are the few of the risks that we can identify from network analysis. And then, of course, the question is, there we go, how do you address these risks, and how do you strengthen the collaboration and improve agility? And of course, once you know what the networks look like and what the organization-specific risks are, then you can target the interventions to have the greatest impact. So I'll give you one example here, and it's a leadership team that wants to have more cross-departmental knowledge exchange. And as you can see there to the left, that's not really happening at the moment. It was a network with a big hole in it, very few relationships, and especially between the departments that are represented by the colors here. And in fact, we often see that the leadership team is the most fragmented team in an organization. And that, of course, has a big impact on the rest of the organization, because if the leaders can't pull together as one, then how can we expect the rest of the organization to? So for this team here, the solution is not to tell everyone to collaborate with everyone else, because that's, first of all, not possible, and secondly, it doesn't make sense. So instead, what we did here is to use the network data with some other data as well to find out who the 4 people were that would have the greatest impact on agility if they connected to each other. And you can see they're circled there to the left, and then kind of we've made a simulation. So if they 4 to connect to each other, what does it look like? And we can immediately see the impact. The network is more coherent. The paths between all of the people are shorter, and agility has actually increased by over 20%. Then I want to show you another case, because as I mentioned, not everyone should collaborate with everyone. I think that makes sense to most people. It needs to be intentional and not just for the sake of it. Right? So this is another case. We're now looking at an organization that's a pharmaceutical company in Portugal, about 200 people. And they had recently gone through a big structural transformation with completely new teams, new reporting lines. Most people had a new role description. And after a few months, the leaders still felt like people were a bit confused, not necessarily very happy with the new ways of working. Plus, the annual engagement survey scored low on the statement that was, we collaborate effectively across teams. And they were also slow to adapt to customers' changing needs. So as a solution, the leaders thought, okay, we need to collaborate more. We need to really encourage people to reach out across teams more. But then when we did this network analysis, we could see that there was definitely not a problem with the quantity of collaboration, but instead they were almost too well connected. And as you can see, there are a lot of relationships going across everywhere. The colors that represent the teams are all mixed up, so collaboration happens everywhere, kind of team agnostic. And as it turns out, people were still collaborating with their previous teammates, because we know relationships are sticky and we don't just break them because we move into a new team. People also had new bonds with their new teammates, and on top of this, leaders were encouraging people to collaborate more. Right? So as a result, people didn't really have much time left for the actual patients and customers whose needs they were serving. So for this company, the low score on the effective collaboration question in the engagement survey had nothing to do with the quantity of collaboration, but with the quality. And so this is where we get to the point of actually defining the purpose of collaboration. And that was also one of the actions for this organization, to support people to be more intentional in the way that they connect to each other. Great. Let's move into the next part about building belonging.
Yeah, and great stuff there, Sunny. I think when we're talking about collaboration, connection, we know that that is not possible if everyone does not feel a shared sense of belonging. So let's talk a little bit about some ways to build this belonging based on what we've discussed so far. So this is a slide that we like to talk about a lot, because we talk about codifying human experience factors in relation to personas, which we're all familiar with in our organizations, I'm sure. But they're powerful tools to understand the various individual humans in our organization and to then shape our employee experience, right? So we talk sometimes about a shift from a psychological, messaging forward perspective and point of view to more of a sociological point of view that's focused on experiences. And all too often, our organizations segment employees by role, position, geography, you name it, right? And then we try to identify the best channels to connect and communicate with them at any given moment, any given day. But we're trying to talk about flipping that to a new approach, right? So instead, let's start to understand the personas in our network through the lenses that focus on emotional status, joys, motivators, energizers, not demographic segments. Let's make it custom, not universal. Let's focus on the messiness inherent in our networks, not a controlled environment. And then lastly, autonomy and trustworthiness from a management perspective, not constraints. So with this human first mindset and approach, we can make more progress connecting to and impacting our employees with technologies, structures, skills, and capabilities. So again, it's focusing on our people to give them what they need. But beyond that, right, we can then start to identify the deeper needs, right? We hone in and understand the people that we're talking to at an emotional level, a different way. We can start to build empathy, help drive experiences that truly connect, motivate, and ultimately fulfill. And then you continue to go, right? And you can get deeper and deeper into the wants and needs, the motivators, the fears and hurdles. So taking this approach, rather than saying, okay, we've got 100 people that sit in a geography, what do we want to talk to them about? Bringing this human dimension, talking to them in a different way. You still might focus on that geography, but really dimensionalizing the people to connect in new and important ways. And something that we focus on a lot at Gagen and that we spoke to earlier is the digital impact, right? And so each individual's needs are unique on a day-to-day basis. The same thing applies to their technology needs. They're not separate, right? We talk about digital as human, an extension of how we work and behave, right? And the research bears this out. People who work at companies that describe technology, are described as tech innovators, see higher employee experience scores across all dimensions: productivity, sense of belonging, overall satisfaction, right? So your organization starts to behave in different ways if you bring that intentional lens to digital and empowering connections through your invisible and visible networks. So what does this mean for our employee experience? We start with a human holistic approach. You've got a diagram here. These are the 6 levers that we talk about that shape our culture and drive sustained success. Experiences shape beliefs. Beliefs influence thinking. Perception-based thinking drives actions. Those actions drive results. To continue to achieve and sustain results, experiences require continuous shaping and nurturing, just like our networks. Shape the experience, shape your culture in meaningful human ways. What we focused on through a lot of today and what I brought up earlier was energy, right? And I think that energy is a very important factor here to focus on. What the last 2 years have shown us, as we talked about in the beginning, is that energy is a precious, finite resource within our organizations. So identifying where that energy flow is happening in our visible networks and invisible networks is key to building a culture that energizes and drives fulfillment, especially important in today's world coming through our pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. Energy is really something that we actually have to pay a bit more attention to now than when we were all working from the office, because when we all meet each other face to face all the time, then the energizing connections or interactions tend to happen more organically and automatically. We bump into someone that we know and have a little chat, or we meet someone for lunch that we like that actually works in a different part of the organization, or we just have a random conversation with someone we happen to have something in common with. But as we've moved towards a more remote and hybrid working space during the pandemic, things have changed. And so by now, I think we've figured out how to do the more transactional interactions effectively in the virtual space, whereas others, more qualitative interactions, are actually still better face-to-face, not least those energizing interaction that we actually see at the very top of this graph here. And there's actually also some recent research by Microsoft that shows that while there tends to be this kind of struggle that Rob was talking about before between the employees who wants the flexible and hybrid setup and the managers who want people to increasingly come back to the office, there is this one thing that does motivate people to come back into the office, and that is exactly connectivity. So yeah, actually 84% of people say that they would be motivated to come into work more frequently if they were promised that it was for the reason of being able to enhance connections with coworkers. And as you also said, Rob, here, it has suffered during the pandemic, the energizing relationships. We can see in our research at INNOVISOR that 30% of energizing relationships at work have been lost, actually, which has resulted in an average of 22% of people in organizations. They don't have any energizing relationships at work at all, which compares to around 5% pre-pandemic. And so this, of course, results in more loneliness at work, a lack of that sense of belonging, which is often related to less trust, less loyalty, not the same feeling of togetherness and connection to that common goal of the organization. And so again, if we come back to talking a little bit about risks, then research shows that employees who do feel connected are 50% more likely to be engaged at work, whereas the employees who lack any energizing connections at work are 90% more likely to leave their company. So this is really something that we have to pay attention to and really promote those energizing connections where they're needed. And so, for instance, people that don't have enough energizing interactions at work, they often tend to have low tenure. And that's also something that we found in our research that was very interesting. So here we're looking at a graph that is based on our research into our benchmark database at INNOVISOR, which contains data from all of our clients over the years. And when we looked into how well people were integrated over time into their companies, we could see something interesting. So in this graph here, you can see that the people that are all the way over to the right, so they have the high tenure, they're well integrated into their organization. They have a good network, a lot of relationships with different colleagues. All the way to the left, we have the newcomers who just joined and therefore are not so integrated yet in their company. That's not so strange. But what is surprising, or that we found surprising, was that dip there in the middle of the curve. And that actually represents the people who started in their company specifically during the first COVID wave, so during spring 2020, March to June, I think. And so now, 2 years or more later, that group of people that started during that time, they're still less integrated into their company than their colleagues with a lower tenure who actually started after them. So basically, companies have figured out the onboarding process and how to do that virtually by now, but those people that started at the time when we didn't know exactly how to do that, they kind of fell in between the chairs. So basically, I think the point of all this is to say that there are all sorts of different experiences, all sorts of different levels of connectivity in an organization. And so we need to be intentional and knowledgeable about how and where we feel connectivity. And that can only happen when we actually check in with our people. And we need to check in with all of them to get their input, because that's how we can move forward. So I think that's a good note to end on, unless you have anything you want to add, Rob?
No, that was beautifully done. Thank you, Sunny. Yeah. So just a quick recap of where we've been today, right? 1, make the invisible visible. We want to identify and activate networks across the organization, infuse our interactions with purpose and intentionality, and build belonging and support by focusing on each person's needs within the culture. And with that, we are more than happy and delighted to move to Q&A.
Yes, thank you everyone who has already given us a question. We can still accept questions, so just a reminder, there is that QA box at the bottom right of your screen. And so with that, I will open up to the first question to you both. What process is used to map these informal networks?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's kind of, I skipped that part about the methodology, right? But what we base our network analysis on is a survey that is designed and tailored to the purpose that you're trying to achieve, right? So if there's a structural transformation, the survey would be different from a rollout of a new vision, let's say. And so that survey is sent out to everyone in the organization that is affected by the change or the initiative. So everyone in scope responds, and then we ask different types of questions. So we'd ask network questions about different types of relationships, and people nominate their colleagues. Who would you reach out to when you need help and advice? Who do you reach out to when you need to make sense of certain things? And so different relationship questions like that. And then we also add questions that have more to do with engagement and perceptions and emotions, because when we overlay those data with each other, then that's really when we get to where we can design some targeted actions where we can find those risks, as I mentioned, and how to mitigate them in the best way. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. My next question from the audience is, what is the leadership's role in getting this done, in fueling collaboration and connection?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in first on that one, Sunny, if you don't mind. I think that there's going to be some variance in how this is answered. But when we do our work at Gagen and we focus on aligning leadership, it's all around behaviors and symbols and actions, right? So if your culture is not performing well, your productivity is not performing well. And ultimately, leadership is responsible for that. So at a practical level, there's an imperative to make sure that your culture is optimized and performing well, and discover how people are working and connecting to each other. So well-being is a factor in that, as much as getting the right projects done on time is a factor into that as well, right? So I'm speaking in generalities, but once you have leadership alignment that this is something we need to focus on, and you have buy-in to get it done, I think really then it's leadership kind of modeling the behaviors that they want to see and modeling where we're going on this roadmap to change our experience of our culture for each employee, right? Leaders included, because leaders are employees too, right? So it's important all the way up and down the organizational chart. Sunny, anything you would add to that? Great question, though.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think from the network perspective, as I mentioned, what we often see is that the leadership team is actually the most fragmented one. So that's really a prerequisite for the rest of the organization to fuel connectivity is, of course, for the leadership team to actually be coherent. So when we do network analysis of an organization, that is going to be often one of the actions to make sure that the leadership is coherent, and so that they can then, as you say, role model that to the rest of the organization and really, pull together as one.
Great answers. Thank you both. Another question, is belonging considered as a necessary intention of connection? What pattern do you see?
Sunny, did you want to take that one first?
Yeah, could you read that question again?
Of course. Is belonging considered as a necessary intention of connection, or what patterns do you see?
I think it doesn't have to be a necessary intention for connection. I think belonging is more something that underpins how connectivity plays out in the networks. But I think, as I mentioned, there are so many different types of relationships, and some are going to be more transactional or formal. And of course, there's that we need those as well in a company to make things work. So I think belonging is more, it needs to be kind of a part of the culture, and there needs to be a sense of belonging, but I think it doesn't have to be, as the question was put, the intent of each connection that explicitly. What would you say, Rob?
Yeah, I think it's inherent, right? Because as we mentioned when that belonging slide came up, right? Collaboration, connection can't happen successfully and authentically without everyone on the team that's participating feeling safe, right? And I think human experience factors wise, like I put on that slide, safety in all aspects is one of the most important dimensions of belonging, right? Can I show up as my authentic self to this meeting or work session or conversation in order to be present fully in what we're trying to achieve. So I think belonging as intention for connection is a little bit different, but I would say that belonging is essential and core to successful, meaningful collaboration to drive whatever initiative you're working on forward, right? That's how I would kind of position it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm talking to somebody else.
I think it, and I think it sets us up nice for this next question. So how can we balance flexibility over work days with connectivity?
Yeah, I can start off. I think. Oh, yeah.
Can you just repeat the question, Hannah, real quick? Sorry.
Of course. How can we balance flexibility over work days with connectivity?
Yeah, I think what I'm thinking is that when we talk about like returning to the office and how much to be there and not, and the flexibility that should be offered, I think what matters when we kind of draw up these policies is that there needs to be a purpose of coming into the office. So when you kind of shape those policies, it's not going to make sense for people to just hear, yeah, okay, you need to be here 3 days a week and it's going to be these days and the rest you can choose. There needs to be a purpose. Okay, we come in on these days, and on those days we're going to focus on social connectivity, energizing interaction, complex problem solving, whatever it is. I think there needs to be a purpose for coming in. And then I think it makes sense to require certain days in the office or meeting face to face. And then for the others to be flexible. So kind of finding the sweet spot between the individual flexibility and the individual needs and the needs of a team, where there are certain things that you need to achieve together.
Yeah, I love that. And I can give the example of our firm. You know, across our 25-year history, we've been a hybrid firm from the start, right? So we've had people in various locations collaborating and working on projects and clients and initiatives together. And, you know, that can seem like it would fuel some disconnection, but we then also invest in time to come together, whether as teams, right, or as an entire firm. So we invest in that time to connect socially in order to build culture together when team members might be scattered across the country. Since going, fully remote and hybrid through the pandemic, I think that there's even more want and need to do that. And so the question to us as leaders becomes, to Sunny's point, like, how are we being intentional with bringing our teams together in person when we can, right? And how are we making sure that individual needs are focused on in that situation if one person can't make it to that meeting, or somebody doesn't feel like traveling because they might get sick, right? Or they have pre-existing conditions. So considering all those factors and connectivity and how we bring people together is sort of core. I hope that answers the question, but I think it's a combination of things. It's allowing the flexibility to work where you need to be, but then also making time and investment to bring people together, to Sunny's point, with intentionality.
Yeah, wonderful. And before we get to the next question, I just wanted to remind everyone that you can still access the resources on the paperclip icon at the bottom of the page. And there, you can still give us some questions. If we don't get to them in this session, we will try our best to answer them after the session. Good. So our next question is kind of coming from the other angle. So how important is engagement nowadays with employees working from home and enjoying it?
That's a great question. I'll just jump in and start riffing on this. I think engagement is just as important, if not more important, with employees working from home. I think it's a matter of how are we tapping into that engagement and checking in on that engagement, where we have what can kind of be a barrier in the form of a digital screen, right? So you might be having the interaction, thinking people are engaged. They might slam their computer shut and be exhausted, or, just need to step away for a minute. So the dynamic is a little different, but I think it's kind of acknowledging and trying to nurture an authentic conversation. And again, that's where that belonging and sense of safety comes up, is like, are you comfortable working this way? What can work better for you? And but we might not always have time to check in with every employee every day in that way. I think being mindful of that in all our interactions is key to keeping that engagement up. But I think it's just as important, if not more important, as we've seen through all these, trends and buzzwords like the Great Resignation and quiet quitting going around. It's the same struggle that we've always had with engagement. It's how do we keep it up? It's just a different dynamic now.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well put.
Great, thank you both. Next question. Do you see the same pattern in introvert teams versus extrovert teams?
Good question.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I can say that in general, we usually don't have that context when we analyze the network, but the leaders will have that context and can add to that. But we do know that, especially when we look at, I was talking about these key people or key roles in a network that certain people occupy. And one of the ones that we do look at a lot is the 3%, as we find that influences up to 90% of the rest of the organization. So they kind of influence other people's engagement and perceptions because they are more trusted. People find them both sympathetic, they're nice people, but people also think that they actually know some things about what's going on. They're quite good at their job. And the combination of this it creates trust. So there are certain people that have more of this than others in an organization. And those people we have found are often actually introverts, which I believe have to do with that they're better listeners. And at least for myself, I can relate to that the people that I would trust or listen to more are the ones who are actually, they listen to what I say and my questions before they answer, right? They're not the quickest one to say this is what it is and this is how you should think, but they're actually good listeners, more introvert and kind of more inwards looking. So that's something that we have found in relation to introverts and extroverts.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question and dynamic to think about. And I think it's really culturally driven, right? Every organization and culture pays attention to that in different ways. And I think, really acknowledging that within your team, if you can, will be key to then enhancing that experience for the introverts versus the extroverts, right? So how do you then find ways to balance conversations to include all viewpoints where some might need more time to process and then come back with an answer rather than just kind of speak up or be willing to kind of riff on a topic at any given moment. So I think there's a cultural factor in sort of acknowledging, are we willing to put in the work to identify and speak to our employees in this way? Are you more introverted than extroverted? Is that a conversation that you're comfortable having with your employer or your boss? And from there, taking that information and really using it to craft the cultural experience for your team in a new way. It's something as simple as using strengths finders or a personality type of test with a team to identify where people can balance each other out to find the right fit and how we work together as a group. So it's never perfect. There's always sort of the dynamic of we need to get things done in this amount of time. But I think acknowledging it and operating based on that is really a cultural question for the organization you're in.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So how complicated is it to evaluate belonging and connectivity in an organization?
Sunny, do you want to start?
I'll start. Yeah. Yes. How complicated is it? I think, that's what we do at INNOVISOR. So I'd say for us, it's not that complicated. And in our engagement with our clients as well, it's not a complicated project that takes a lot of time. It's usually a quick process where we can identify these things, the level of connectivity and the level of belonging as well, from different angles, basically with different type of, as I mentioned, both network data, but also engagement and perception and emotional data. I think for an organization that would want to do it themselves, I would say it's not as easy, and I would say that, again, just coming back to the people first approach, that it comes down to asking the people for their input on this. Because I know some organizations or companies would use more kind of digital data or technical networks like email traffic or things like that, or any other platform data, basically. So that would be probably a less complicated way of analyzing connectivity and belonging. But in our opinion, that's not going to give you the context and the value of the relationships that you actually need to make an impact with your interventions. So in that sense, yeah, it depends on what you mean with complicated, but it can absolutely be done.
Yeah, I love that. Hannah, if you don't mind, do we have a minute to address one more question? That's just really relevant. Yeah. Rodrigo Sierra asked, should we set policies or principles? And I think what's fascinating is we were doing some research and we came across that Microsoft Work Trend Index study where, again, they found 84% of people would be motivated to come into work more frequently by being able to enhance connections with coworkers. And then some of the dynamic we said at the beginning is that organizations, leaders are trying to use corporate policies to force people back in, which is kind of at odds, where instead you might just be able to leverage the fact that people want to connect as a way to get people together, right? And so, again, it's sort of work where you need to be as a principal, and it's if we need to do some really focused collaboration or really all align on ways of working for a large program, let's connect socially to understand our team dynamic and really use that as an opportunity to talk about how we then do those things together as a group, right? And then when people need to go do heads down work, they're probably going to work better at home than they will in the office, right? That's kind of what we're seeing as the employee dynamic right now. So I think it's a fine line. There's, depending on your organization, its size and culture and how you need to get things done, there'll be variance there. But that research clearly showed that, like, where policies are being enacted, employees are sort of revolting against that. Principles might be a little bit of a different story, I think, when it comes to, how we connect and how we work. So great question, though.
Thank you for that, and thank you to all the attendees for your time and all the wonderful questions, and a big thank you to Senna and Rob for today.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And feel free to reach out afterwards as well, I should say, email or LinkedIn.
Yep, absolutely.
Wonderful. And just as a reminder, our final webinar on mergers, acquisitions, and culture is happening on the 14th of November, same time. So make sure you register for that, and we will see you then. And I wish you all a wonderful afternoon or evening or day, wherever you might be, and hope to see you on the 14th. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.